means of telling the truth and who's going to get to speak the truth about the world. Okay? Now, in the Enlightenment in the West, that fight was substantially won by the scientists. That is to say, the general culture came to accept that if you let religious authorities speak about truth on the basis of revelation, that they would absolutely willingly lie in order to protect their own power, rather than listen to a reasonable explanation of what the truth was. Okay, and that fight, that battle, has a strong underlying influence in American culture. Because as much as we often distrust scientists, we distrust the church even more. Okay? And so we have our doubts whether scientists always tell the truth, and you know this whole thing over the, the climate change, stuff like that. But still, in the end, if we've got a scientist in the room and we've got a bishop in the room, most Americans are likely to trust the scientist, at least on the natural world, and think that the bishop probably knows nothing. And I, by the way, I run into this all the time because I'm a specialist. I'm in religion. I teach religion. I go up to the university, to the engineering school. I go up to the science school. As soon as I say I'm a theologian, they all just glaze over. You have nothing to say. I might as well be an English lit major. You live in the realm of fantasy and fiction, right? And you're one of those people who wants to impose your fantasies and fictions on us. So that's a lot of it. There still exists a lot of suspicion in the West about the assertion of religious authorities to know the truth, because religion is seen as oppressing the truth, always oppressing the truth. Okay? Now, what that means in terms of American attitudes towards Muslims is, because Muslims strongly assert that their revealed truth is a firm way of knowing the truth about the world, then from that particular American consciousness, Muslims are, well, authoritarian, absolute, or just foolish. Because that's the typically American way of understanding people who assert that religion can tell you about the natural world, is to assume that they're bogus. Now, what that means, of course, is that they have not taken any time to understand an Islamic perspective on this pursuit of truth and science, right? But I think what happens is Americans read into Islam this long 300-year battle with the Catholic Church. And they assume that Islam is just like the Catholic Church. And they go, we won that battle a long time ago, we're not going back there. Right? That means that an Islamic understanding of science desperately needs to come into the dialogue so that Americans can understand that when they speak to Muslims, they're not talking to a 15th century pope, right? They're talking to some modern person. Now, how do you do that? Well, some of you probably know the work of Fazlur Rahman on the Islamization, and Ismail Faruqi for that matter. I like Rahman better than Faruqi, but anyway, it's my taste. Both of whom were very interested in how you integrate and understand the close relationship between science and revealed knowledge, and were very, very sophisticated in their approach to these things. In Malaysia, Syed Naguib Alatas, more recently Anwar Ibrahim, who I also like. In Turkey, Syed Nursi, of course, Fethullah Gulen, wrestled with these issues. In other words, and in more modern terms, although in the social perspective, Abdullah Ad-Naim, Tariq Ramadan have talked about the political sciences. If Americans will understand that the Islamic world didn't evolve like the Western world in this issue, and that it has its own deep tradition of considering this problem, and that in fact it is all of our problems, right? If you believe that God reveals God's self at all, then you must figure out how it is that rational human beings deal with God's revelation and the revelation that's found in nature, right? If we could then see through dialogue that it is a commonly shared problem to which both traditions bring resources and thought, then I think we can make a lot more progress than if we just face off religion versus science, with one group saying, well, we're for science, and everybody else saying we're for religion, and not understanding what that team means. I hope that makes sense to you. Okay, that's the third big issue I see, and I think it's one of the most difficult, and it's one that hits the hardest in academia. Because bear in mind, the problem that science has with religion is not just a problem with Islam, it's a problem with other religions. So you have an internal Christian argument laid over an argument between American Christians and Muslims. It's very complex, but dialogue is the solution, okay? And that gets me to a last note about this dialogue, which is that probably what needs to be gained most if we're going to reform American attitudes towards Islam is both sides need to overcome the problem of the classic problem in dialogue of my comparing my ideal with your real, okay? My ideal with your real, or your ideal with my real. Now, what do I mean by ideal and real? Well, I've got a whole bookshelf of books that I'm sent to review, and this is my shelf of really bad books about Islam that are so bad I won't review them, okay? I'm not going to dignify them by review. But a typical one, and let's talk about one of our favorite authors, Robert Spencer. Okay, I know he's well beloved in the Muslim community. Robert Spencer always begins his books, and he's got 2 or 3 little diatribes with something like, Jesus and Christianity have always stood for peace, love, and harmony. But when we look at Muslim armies that advanced and destroyed and da-da-da, and he goes on to the whole thing about jihad, right? So what have you got here? Christian ideal, peace. Muslim real, war. Okay, now, I don't know any historian that would deny that Muslims were engaged in wars, right? On the other hand, Christians were engaged in wars too, right? And by the way, if you start going, well, my Muslim wars were better than your Christian wars, well, you'll never get anywhere historically there, will you? Right? I mean, that's a nowhere argument, okay? But of course, I do hear that argument in reverse though, right? Islam stands, salam, for peace. It's the religion of peace. Whereas you Christians were crusaders from the beginning, marching with your armies across the Muslim lands, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, that's your ideal with my real. Well, my real is not very happy, but wait a minute. Why do you get to use your ideal and it goes against my real? Yes, there's a lot of nasty Christian people. I've met a lot of nasty Muslim people too. Okay, let's forget real versus real. Where we have a chance for dialogue is if we speak to each other about our ideals. Not about the past, where people have behaved badly on all sides, but the kind of future that we want to create where we try to live out of our ideals, many of which are shared. Many of which are shared. And I think if we can do that, if we can, and this is a Christian problem, by the way, Christians need to consistently look and try to understand Muslim ideals rather than constantly comparing their Christian ideals with the Muslim real. But at the same time, I've got to say, there has to be reciprocity there, right? But if we can do that, if we can talk and dialogue about our ideals, I think that we'll find we have a great deal in common and that our mutual attitudes towards one another will be reformed, but in particular we'll have, I'm not saying it's going to make it all sweetness and light in the next 10 years, but I think we'll begin to see ourselves as fellow human beings who are people of faith, people who are trying to live out what it means to be faithful to God, who does put the universe into order and does give us freedom and responsibility to participate in that. And then I think we'll have a chance of reforming these American attitudes towards Islam. Well, I think that's a good place to stop, and there may be some questions or discussion, which I'll be happy to answer.
I have 2 short questions. Yes. The first one is, since you said that it was the church who opposed the science rather than the individual, so can we say that a devout, faithful person become a very perfect scientist at the same time? This is my first question. And the second one is, sometimes during the interfaith dialogue process, we, or let's say I, encounter with a person of another faith, and when I want to make some compliments about his faith, sometimes there is the danger of offending that person, unknowingly, or there's some kind of misunderstandings. So maybe because of